The first time they locked a man inside ADX Florence, the silence hit harder than any sentence ever could. It wasn't the bars or the concrete that broke him, it was the way the place seemed to swallow human sound like it was starving for it. If stories like this fascinate you, hit subscribe, because this one only gets darker. Before ADX became the final stop for America's most dangerous criminals, it was a response to chaos the government could no longer control. By the early 1990s, federal prisons were overflowing with men who had turned the system into a war zone: bombers, cartel lieutenants, gang shot callers, escaped death row inmates. Every transfer seemed like a new mistake waiting to explode. Wardens whispered that some inmates weren't just violent, they were contagions, capable of spreading rebellion like a spark in a dry forest. It all came to a head in 1992, when a high-profile inmate orchestrated a coordinated stabbing in a supposedly secure facility. The attack wasn't the shocking part. What terrified officials was how it had been planned, through coded messages sent from inside solitary confinement itself. That incident shook the Bureau of Prisons enough to fast-track something extreme, something unprecedented. A place designed not to rehabilitate, but to contain. Not to punish, but to neutralize. By the time construction crews broke ground in the Colorado desert, the name Florence had already traveled through every penitentiary in the country like a rumor people hoped wasn't true. Inmates who heard of it said the same thing: that's where they send you when they want you erased. But in those early days, before the concrete cured and the paint dried, a transfer arrived that froze even the staff. His name wasn't released to the public. His case file was sealed. The only thing officers were told was this: he cannot, under any circumstances, communicate with another human being. The convoy that delivered him moved like a military operation: multiple blacked-out vehicles, aerial support, road closures along the entire route. Guards later said the man didn't speak, didn't blink, didn't react to anything. Not a threat, but a presence. When they escorted him into the unfinished complex, the air still smelled of wet cement. Only a few units were operational, but his cell, the cell he'd been assigned, had been completed first. Reinforced steel. No direct lines of sight. Thick glass. A slot so small even a whisper wouldn't travel through it. The warden himself supervised the placement. He watched as the inmate stepped inside, turned once, and scanned the bare walls like he was memorizing them. As if he were calibrating the limits of the place meant to hold him. For the Bureau of Prisons, this moment marked the transformation. ADX wasn't just another supermax anymore, it was becoming a containment strategy, a firewall against the worst-case scenarios America feared. And the arrival of that inmate was the quiet announcement that the country had crossed a line, from control to absolute isolation. But something went wrong that night. The correctional officer assigned to monitor his cell reported an anomaly, an irregularity on the surveillance feed. A brief flicker, followed by something he couldn't explain. He said the inmate was standing in the far corner, then suddenly, he wasn't. No one believed him, but the report stayed in the system. And the next morning, when the warden reviewed the logs, one detail sent a ripple of unease through the entire command staff. The man had received no visitors, no mail, no contact. Yet a piece of paper, a small, torn scrap, lay on the floor of his supposedly impenetrable cell. For words, written in pencil: "You built this wrong." The warden tried to treat the message as a prank, a glitch, anything but what it looked like. But the officers who found that scrap of paper never forgot the way their hands shook when they picked it up. ADX was supposed to be flawless: layers of steel, reinforced concrete, and surveillance so tight it felt surgical. If a message could slip in, then something inside the design wasn't as airtight as Washington believed. They quietly increased monitoring of the inmate, but the feed only made things stranger. He didn't speak. He barely moved. He paced the same 5 steps, stood still for hours, then repeated. Every shift recorded the same pattern, except for one anomaly that kept happening at exactly 3:17 a.m. For 3 straight nights, the camera flickered for a fraction of a second, and in that blink, his position changed. Not impossible, but not explainable either. The staff didn't dare file another irregularity report. At ADX, admitting uncertainty was dangerous. It drew scrutiny from internal investigators, and scrutiny meant someone's career was about to be crushed. So the guards did what ADX guards learned to do: they swallowed their doubts and clocked in. But higher up, pressure was building. Washington was quietly funneling inmates into ADX faster than the facility could absorb them. Not petty criminals. Not even general population troublemakers. These were men whose names triggered high-level briefings: domestic extremists, international operatives, corrupt officials who couldn't be allowed to communicate with the outside. ADX was becoming something no one openly acknowledged: the nation's pressure cooker for its most politically volatile prisoners. By late '94, a pattern emerged. Every major gang shot caller taken off the streets, Florence. Any inmate capable of inciting riots, Florence. Anyone with a following, a cause, or the intelligence to weaponize information, Florence. The prison wasn't just receiving dangerous men, it was absorbing entire networks. Inside, the atmosphere changed. Even though inmates were isolated, influence seeped through the smallest cracks: coded gestures during recreation rotations, messages tapped through plumbing, patterns in meal refusals that signaled threats. Guards were trained to stop communication, but they were up against criminals who had turned silence into an art form. Meanwhile, rumors spread among staff about the first inmate, the silent one. Some believed he'd been some kind of government operative gone rogue. Others whispered he had ties to extremist cells that authorities never admitted existed. A few thought he was a test subject, someone sent there to evaluate the prison's defenses before the real transfers began. Only one thing was certain: ADX wasn't prepared for what it was becoming. One night, Officer Morales was completing a routine pass through the control corridor when he noticed something off on the master schematic displayed on the console. A single door icon, cell B13, was highlighted in amber instead of green. It meant manually engaged. Impossible. That door didn't even have a manual override. He pulled up the feed. The camera was clean. The inmate was sitting on the floor, motionless as always. Then Morales zoomed in. There, near the base of the door, he saw a thin, almost invisible line, like a scratch running vertically down the steel. He leaned closer to the monitor. The scratch wasn't random. It was straight. Perfectly straight. A measurement. 6 inches from the floor. 4 inches long. Exactly where someone would test steel density. Morales reported it to the warden, expecting immediate alarm. Instead, the warden dismissed him with a short, cold warning: "You didn't see anything. You don't talk about it again. Clear?" That's when Morales understood why ADX was being filled so quickly. It wasn't just about isolation. It was about containment of criminals, secrets, and whatever truth the Bureau didn't want escaping. 3 days later, the inmate whose cell had been scratched vanished from the logbook. Officially, he'd been transferred out. Unofficially, no one could explain how a man could leave ADX without a single camera capturing the movement. The only evidence he'd ever existed was a second scrap of paper found in the corridor outside his unit. It held just one sentence: "This place will break before they do." The disappearance triggered a quiet panic inside ADX, quiet because no one dared voice it, and panic because everyone understood the same truth: if a man could slip through the most secure prison in America before it was even fully operational, something foundational was wrong. But instead of admitting failure, Washington tightened control. Inspectors arrived in unmarked cars. Construction plans were sealed. Staff were questioned separately and ordered to sign updated confidentiality agreements. The message was unmistakable: the narrative would be whatever the Bureau decided it was. Still, the inmates felt the shift. Even in isolation, they sensed tension like pressure in the walls. Meals arrived late. Recreation rotations were shuffled. Officers walked the corridors with clipped steps and avoided eye contact. The silence of ADX, usually oppressive and steady, had taken on a new tone: alert, watchful, coiled. Warden Harlan, a career bureaucrat who prided himself on composure, was unraveling behind closed doors. He knew what no one else did. The inmate who had vanished wasn't a criminal in the traditional sense. He was the Bureau's worst nightmare, a man who had spent years studying the prison system from the inside, someone who understood leverage, security blind spots, and bureaucratic arrogance better than the people paid to manage it. He wasn't placed in ADX to be controlled. He was placed there because someone feared the truth he carried. Harlan kept replaying a single question in his mind: if a containment facility fails during construction, what happens when they fill it with men who've spent their lives outthinking institutions? Weeks later, the consequences arrived. It started with a coordinated pattern of disruptions, tiny ones, subtle enough that staff blamed coincidence. Lights flickering in one range. An intercom hissing without input. Water pressure dropping across 3 tiers. None of it serious alone, but together, deliberate. Manufactured. Then a coded message surfaced in one of the mailrooms, buried inside a Bible sent from an approved address. The message was short, carved into the inside of the spine with a needle-like tool. They listen through the walls. Stop pretending they don't. The handwriting matched the vanished inmate. For the Bureau, this was the breaking point. They flooded ADX with resources, new sensors, upgraded surveillance, additional tactical staff. They doubled down on secrecy and built new protocols for communication interception. Every system became more rigid, less human. Every decision was made from fear. And in that panic, the transformation was sealed. ADX became the final destination for anyone too dangerous, too political, or too unpredictable to trust anywhere else. It wasn't just a prison, it was America's vault for control, designed to bury not just criminals, but the stories, loyalties, and ideologies that could threaten the nation's stability. Officer Morales, the only staff member still troubled by what he'd witnessed, tried to file an anonymous report with an oversight office outside the Bureau. The report never reached its destination. He was transferred 3 days later, no explanation, no hearing, no farewell briefing. Just gone. By 1996, ADX had earned its unofficial title, the Alcatraz of the Rockies. But inside the walls, staff told a different story, one passed quietly between officers who understood what had been buried. They said ADX didn't rise from necessity. It rose from fear. Fear of inmates who could outsmart the system. Fear of power structures that couldn't be controlled. Fear of secrets that, if spoken, could fracture trust in federal institutions. And the one inmate who vanished. His name never resurfaced. His existence was scrubbed from internal systems. But the warning he left behind still circulates among officers who last long enough to hear it. A prison built on silence eventually collapses under the weight of what it refuses to confront. ADX didn't just transform the federal system, it revealed the cost of burying truth behind concrete and steel. If you think this story was intense, the next one will leave you speechless. Subscribe for more true crime stories that'll keep you on the edge of your seat.